everybody. So today we are going to talk about where we can take forensic anthropology. The key concepts include juvenile osteology, more specifically, sex, ancestry, and pathology identification in juveniles, and what we can learn from that. Second, we're going to take a look at commingled remains and what that means in a forensic anthropological viewpoint with disasters and cooperating within other experts. So juvenile osteology is critical because it can indicate factors of population health, more specifically environmental factors of population health, political or societal factors as well. And this can be looked at through terms of sex, ancestry, and pathologies. So let's take a look at how this works. Well, for sex determination for juveniles, there are new methods that are promising. Using the auricular surface of the ilium, a 2017 study looks at sex predicting for juveniles. They used 21 females and 13 males, ages 7 to 18. And what they state from these findings is that for males, the overall morphology of the auricular surface usually has a lying V shape. The anterior and inferior edges are similar in length. Here we have the anterior and inferior edges being not similar in length. Instead, it's L-shaped. This corresponds with their findings that female auricular surfaces are L-shaped and less symmetrical. So their hypothesis was that their methods would become less accurate as age decreased. This is because sexual dimorphism is less prevalent within young adults and subadults because of puberty not have started that hormonal developmental changes yet. But their theories also showed that their methods were actually replicable and consistent over their sample size. So more studies should be done in regards to this form of sex determination for juveniles, but it is promising. So how can we apply this to bioarchaeology? Well, gender preferences with access to nutrition is a key concept in just one example of how this can be applied. Because due to children being so vulnerable to the impacts of nutritional access and agency, a society's gender preferences can be portrayed through juvenile osteology. This is currently visible through Egypt and Yemen and Jordan specifically, where the author Sharif discusses how nutrition is a key concept that is visible with the gender preferences, specifically a preference towards males in these countries. And we can see these nutritional deficits through osteology. So for ancestry determination for juveniles, we see not many studies done on this because ancestry determination is controversial due to race being a cultural construction and not biologically sound. But there are new methods, as Rainman points out in her study, in her master's thesis, taking a look of samples and collections in order to determine ancestral prediction through osteology. We see that the anterior nasal spine, the inferior nasal aperture, the malar tubercle, the nasal aperture width, and the orbital shape are all key in being able to predict some sort of ancestral origin for juveniles. Now, why is this important? This is important for bioarchaeology because we can, and forensic anthropology, because one, we can identify individuals possibly if there are no other means of doing so. In a bioarchaeological context, we can find racial discriminations and piece together historical concepts through that. Pathologies in juvenile osteology is also important to be able to analyze. So a key study looked at juvenile osteology in the Industrial Revolution, and prior knowledge about population health suggested that urban areas were more likely to have unhealthy children because of the intense labor associated with it. However, there are studies that suggest that families and children were migrating between rural and urban environments more so than previously thought. This was visible through a comparative analysis of urban sites and rural sites looking at juvenile osteology, and they realized that the pathologies were pretty consistent and distributed evenly regarding the sites, both urban and rural. So why is this important? It shows that well, first of all, we have the frontal bone. It's more porous right here, and then we have vitamin D deficiency and rickets right here. And this shows that this explains how juvenile osteology is an important means of studying the past and piecing together historical events in order to get a full picture of what was occurring. So now that we looked at ancestry, sex, and pathological evidence in juvenile osteology and what that can tell us for bioarchaeology and forensic anthropology, we can take a look at commingled remains in forensic cases, which is another concept that I studied and found quite interesting. So from disaster victim identification operations with fragmented, burnt, or commingled remains, this was experience-based recommendations from experts who actually partaked in a lot of investigations, including the September 11th disaster. Now, from a forensic anthropological viewpoint, we see that there were 22,000 fragmentary remains. And clearly this makes sense because of the disaster, but we see that it took 9 months to excavate over this amount of space. It's devastating. And the fact that what I found interesting from this is that as of 2019, 14,696 human fragments have been identified and matched to 1,637 of the 2,749. That means that still to this day, we are still matching and identifying fragments of humans to who they were as individuals. What this means is that a career in forensic anthropology has an extreme weight of ethical responsibilities and should not be taken lightly. What can we learn specifically from these atrocities to better ourselves in the field? Well, the experts in this paper show that we should pay attention to the chain of command. More specifically, as Bower and his colleagues state in their article, typically local authorities will have addressed the chain of command in their response plan. However, confusion about the role of forensic specialists may still cause considerable delay. Delay is not good in disasters. We hold an ethical responsibility to the people, to the victims, to ourselves, to identify individuals and make sense of disasters as best and fast as possible. So a chain of command is important for that. And how will loss be communicated to families and the media is also significant, and a special role that forensic anthropologists can play, because forensic anthropologists have this ability to look at the science, forensics side, as well as the anthropological side. And being able to understand the grief and the beliefs of individuals and via local and universal means is significant in piecing together disaster relief. So communicating information is important to consider as your own forensic anthropology careers take off. And then lastly, experts in forensic archaeology and anthropologists are essential when human remains and fragments are burned. We're going to take a look at this one specifically. So this is just a picture of commingled remains, and the story that Boer and his colleagues explain is that there was a case in the United Kingdom in Wales where a family died with their house burning down. And the original hypothesis was that because these remains were all found together, they had all been in the same room during the time of death. However, experts in the field discuss that their osteology shows that they were actually within different rooms sleeping in their beds during this event. And this is important because they show that although victims, although the victims were together, they moved, and as experts, we can piece together the story of events even better. And this quote stands out to me because it says, even when the number of victims is relatively low, specialist assistance at the scene can significantly contribute to a successful disaster victim identification operation, especially if the remains are fragmented and dispersed or exhibit thermal alterations and commingled. So just because it might be a smaller disaster doesn't mean experts aren't highly needed. Here is a picture of some of the forms that we have to fill out as forensic anthropologists. I like it because it organizes the thoughts. We have conditions, and then conditions of burn, and then amount of fragments. We have weight. Were there any non-human identified? And then we have the pathologies in the skeletal system, which we already discussed. We have findings that are forensically significant. And this really goes to show that paperwork is also an important part of the job, and being organized is important. So the main point looking forward for where we can take forensic anthropology leads us within ourselves and asking the question, what do you personally want to specialize in? We could specialize in the identification of commingled remains. We could specialize in differential preservation, which is important, learning the environmental factors and osteological factors that increase preservation or decrease preservation. We could specialize in recovering burnt remains, or what I found interesting was that with ancestry and sex determination, the easiest way to go about this might just be DNA extraction from bone fragments. And yes, this has its own ethical dilemmas, but being an expert in this, when the only way to identify an individual is through DNA, would be super valuable in disaster cases. And then we could be forensic archaeologists and specialize in excavations, which is important for bioarchaeology as well as disasters, as shown through the 9/11 example. And then the cultural implications that can come from osteology are so significant that being an expert in bioarchaeology and then narrowing that down to your specific historical interests would be super beneficial to history in and of itself. So I hope that gives you some interesting thoughts to think about and consider, but thank you so much.